The ink was still wet when I found the forged documents hidden beneath the ancestral tablets in my husband's family shrine, the black characters glistening like fresh wounds against rice paper that should have held sacred prayers, but instead contained the blueprints for my destruction. My trembling fingers traced the falsified death certificates and fabricated debt records, each stroke of the brush a calculated lie designed to strip away everything Takeshi had died protecting on distant battlefields where his blood had watered foreign soil. The metallic taste of betrayal filled my mouth as I realized that while I had been lighting incense for his departed soul and weeping over his empty grave, his own family had been systematically erasing my legal right to exist as his widow, transforming grief into a weapon that would leave me more destitute than any war orphan begging in temple courtyards. In 16th century Japan, a widow's inheritance could disappear faster than her husband's funeral smoke, vanishing into the pockets of male relatives who understood that the law favored those bold enough to act while tears were still fresh on mourning veils. The rigid social structure that governed our lives contained loopholes wide enough for entire fortunes to slip through, and I discovered that night that my husband's clan had been studying these legal gaps with the dedication of military strategists planning a siege. They had positioned themselves like chess masters, moving pieces across a board where I was both the prize and the sacrifice. Each family member assigned a specific role in the elaborate theater of false sympathy that would culminate in my complete financial annihilation. Like wolves circling wounded prey, they had waited for my tears to dry before showing their teeth. But what they failed to understand was that grief can transform into something far more dangerous than sorrow when it discovers itself surrounded by predators wearing the masks of protectors. Takeshi's eldest brother Kenji had perfected the art of concerned condolences while mentally cataloging the value of every silk kimono in my wardrobe. His wife Midori had mastered the delicate balance between supportive embraces and subtle inventory assessments of my jewelry collection. And their youngest brother Hiroshi had developed an impressive talent for steering conversations toward my late husband's supposed gambling debts that existed nowhere except in the documents they had carefully forged during the long nights while I knelt in prayer. The candlelight flickered across the shrine room as I knelt there, surrounded by evidence of their betrayal. And I understood with crystalline clarity that I stood at the crossroads between becoming another forgotten victim of masculine greed or transforming into something that would teach them the true meaning of regret. The wooden floor beneath my knees felt cold as winter stone, but the fire building in my chest burned with the heat of a forge where new weapons are shaped from raw metal. And as I carefully returned their forged documents to their hiding place, I made a silent promise to my husband's spirit that his family's treachery would become the foundation of their own destruction. If you've ever discovered that the people offering comfort were actually sharpening knives behind their backs, then you know the precise moment when mourning stops being passive and starts becoming something that hungers for justice, with teeth sharp enough to tear through lies and leave truth bleeding in its wake. The morning of Takeshi's memorial service arrived wrapped in autumn mist that clung to the temple grounds like the breath of restless spirits. And I watched through tear-swollen eyes as his family transformed sacred ritual into a grotesque inventory assessment disguised as traditional mourning. They moved through the ceremonial preparations with the efficiency of merchants evaluating merchandise, their whispered conversations floating beneath the heavy incense smoke like poisonous prayers that honored profit more than the memory of the dead. Kenji positioned himself near the altar where my husband's favorite possessions had been displayed as offerings, his calculating gaze measuring the worth of each item, while his mouth formed the proper words of grief that meant nothing to his mercenary heart. The scent of burning sandalwood mixed with something more acrid, the smell of greed disguised as sorrow, as Midori circulated among the mourners with practiced grace, her silk sleeves rustling like currency being counted as she noted which neighbors possessed influence that might prove useful in future legal disputes. She paused beside elderly Mrs. Tanaka, the village's most respected matriarch, her voice dropping to the perfect pitch of confidential intimacy as she planted seeds of doubt about my ability to manage Takeshi's estate without masculine guidance. Her words were surgical in their precision, each syllable designed to cut away at my reputation while building sympathy for the difficult position his family faced in protecting their dead brother's legacy from a potentially unstable widow. Behind the paper screens that separated the main hall from the preparation areas, I caught fragments of Hiroshi's voice as he conducted what sounded like a business negotiation with the temple's head monk, their discussion centering not on prayers for Takeshi's peaceful transition to the next world, but on the proper documentation required for transferring property ownership in cases where the deceased had left behind substantial debts. The taste of bile rose in my throat as I realized that even the sacred space where we honored my husband's memory had been converted into a marketplace where his relatives could establish the legal groundwork for my dispossession, turning Buddhism itself into an accomplice to their financial murder. The funeral drums beat with the rhythm of a countdown, marking time until the ceremonial period of mourning would end and they could begin the open warfare they had been preparing for. But what they failed to notice was how carefully I documented every whispered conversation, every meaningful glance, every subtle gesture that revealed the true nature of their performance. I knelt beside Takeshi's coffin with the posture of a grieving widow, while my mind worked with the precision of a military strategist, cataloging their weaknesses and mapping the network of corruption they had assembled to support their theft. Understanding that the funeral itself was merely the opening battle in a war they assumed I lacked the intelligence or courage to fight. If you discovered people were dividing your belongings while you knelt grieving over your spouse's coffin, would you confront them immediately or gather evidence first? Your instincts might demand immediate action, but I chose the patience of a hunter who understands that the most dangerous prey requires careful stalking. And as the ceremony concluded with their false tears still glistening on cheeks that had never known genuine sorrow for Takeshi's loss, I realized that they had made the fatal error of mistaking my silent observation for helpless acceptance of their predatory intentions. The sophisticated machinery of my legal destruction revealed itself piece by piece over the following weeks, each forged document a masterwork of deception that demonstrated just how long my husband's family had been planning this elaborate theft while sharing rice at our dinner table and celebrating New Year festivals in our home. The false debt records bore the seals of legitimate merchants who had been bribed or threatened into supporting the fiction that Takeshi had borrowed vast sums to fund a gambling addiction that existed nowhere except in the imagination of relatives who had learned that dead men make convenient scapegoats for fabricated financial catastrophes. Each document was aged with tea stains and weathered edges, crafted with the attention to detail of master forgers who understood that successful theft requires paperwork as convincing as the performance of grief they had displayed at his funeral. The network of corruption they had assembled operated with the efficiency of a well-oiled military campaign, encompassing village officials whose signatures could be purchased for the price of a good meal, temple monks whose moral authority could be rented along with their ceremonial seals, and merchant allies whose testimony about fictional transactions would sound credible to any magistrate unfamiliar with the intricate web of lies they had spent months weaving around my husband's posthumous reputation. I discovered through careful investigation that the local tax collector had been promised a percentage of any property seizures he could facilitate through expedited legal processes, while the district's religious authority had been convinced that supporting the clan's efforts to control a potentially unstable widow was a service to community harmony that deserved both spiritual merit and material compensation. Feudal Japanese law granted widows inheritance rights that should have protected me from such blatant theft, but corrupt families could exploit bureaucratic delays and forge documentation to steal everything before legal protections took effect, turning the very system designed to ensure justice into a weapon for those bold enough to purchase the right signatures and patient enough to construct elaborate lies. The timing of their assault had been calculated with mathematical precision. They would present their fabricated evidence during the vulnerable period between Takeshi's death and the formal probate proceedings, when emotional distress made me an unreliable witness to my own financial circumstances and social custom discouraged aggressive self-defense from recently bereaved women who were expected to accept guidance from male relatives with grateful submission. The most chilling aspect of their conspiracy was the casual efficiency with which they had transformed every shared memory of happiness into evidence of my husband's supposed moral failings, rewriting our marriage as a tragic tale of a good man destroyed by vice and a naive woman too blind to recognize the signs of his spiritual corruption. They had coached witnesses to recall conversations that never happened, gambling debts that were never incurred, and business dealings that existed only in the elaborate fiction they had constructed to justify stealing everything we had built together during 7 years of marriage that had been genuine, even if their concern for his memory was entirely fabricated. What would you do if you discovered that your deceased spouse's family had been planning to rob you before his body was even cold, their condolences masking months of preparation for a theft so comprehensive it would leave you with nothing except the clothes on your back and the bitter knowledge of how thoroughly you had been deceived? Your answer might reveal whether you have the killer instinct necessary for survival in a world where grief makes you vulnerable and trust becomes a luxury that can cost you everything you have left of the person you loved most. The conspiracy extended far beyond immediate family into a web of complicit neighbors and corrupted officials that revealed how deeply my husband's relatives had infiltrated every institution that should have protected a widow's rights, their influence spreading like poison through the social fabric of our community, until I found myself surrounded by smiling faces that concealed calculating minds. Mrs. Yamamoto, who had brought comfort food to my door every day following Takeshi's death, revealed herself to be a key witness prepared to testify about my husband's supposed gambling habits that she claimed to have observed during visits to our home that I now realized had been reconnaissance missions designed to gather ammunition for the legal assault they were preparing to launch against my inheritance. Her gentle inquiries about my emotional state and ability to manage household finances had not been motivated by concern for my well-being, but by a mercenary desire to establish evidence of my mental instability that could justify placing my deceased husband's assets under the control of his more competent male relatives. The village sake merchant Master Sato had been enlisted to provide testimony about substantial debts Takeshi had allegedly accumulated during drinking sessions that existed only in the detailed fiction his family had constructed to support their theft. His willingness to perjure himself, purchased with promises of preferential treatment in future business dealings with the clan's extensive commercial network. I could taste the metallic bitterness of betrayal in every cup of tea they offered during their visits of false sympathy, every condolence carrying the underlying scent of calculation and greed that I had been too grief-stricken to recognize until the pattern of their deception became impossible to ignore. Even the local physician who had tended Takeshi during his final illness before departing for war had been corrupted into providing statements about my husband's supposedly deteriorating mental condition that would support claims of financial irresponsibility during the months before his deployment. The systematic nature of their betrayal became clear when I discovered that they had been positioning these corrupted witnesses for more than a year before Takeshi's death, suggesting a level of premeditation that transformed their theft from opportunistic greed into calculated murder of my social identity and financial security. They had studied the legal requirements for challenging inheritance rights with the dedication of scholars, identifying every possible weakness in my position and methodically assembling the evidence and testimony needed to exploit those vulnerabilities through a coordinated assault on my reputation and competence that would leave me defenseless against their claims of protective intervention. Previous widows had suffered similar victimization, their stories erased from community memory through a combination of social pressure and strategic violence that ensured no precedent of successful resistance could inspire future targets to fight back against this systematic exploitation of feminine vulnerability. I uncovered whispered references to widow Matsuda, who had lost everything to her husband's family 3 summers ago, and widow Ishida, whose desperate attempts to challenge her dispossession had resulted in mysterious accusations of mental illness that justified her confinement to a distant temple, where her protests could no longer embarrass the relatives who had stolen her children's inheritance. Which betrayal cuts deeper, being robbed by strangers who owe you nothing, or being destroyed by people who sat at your wedding table and promised to honor your husband's memory while they systematically planned to steal everything he died trying to protect? Your answer determines what kind of justice you believe the world deserves, because I learned that the most efficient predators are those who disguise their hunting as acts of mercy, and the most dangerous enemies are those who know exactly where to place the knife to cause maximum damage while maintaining the appearance of reluctant necessity. Previous widows had suffered similar victimization, their stories erased from community memory through a combination of social pressure and strategic violence that ensured no precedent of successful resistance could inspire future targets to fight back against this systematic exploitation of feminine vulnerability. I uncovered whispered references to widow Matsuda, who had lost everything to her husband's family 3 summers ago, and now worked as a servant in the home that had once belonged to her, and widow Ishida, whose desperate attempts to challenge her dispossession had resulted in mysterious accusations of mental illness that justified her confinement to a distant temple where her protests to no longer embarrass the relatives who had stolen her children's inheritance. Which betrayal cuts deeper, being robbed by strangers who owe you nothing, or being destroyed by people who sat at your wedding table and promised to honor your husband's memory while they systematically planned to steal everything he died trying to protect? Your answer determines what kind of justice you believe the world deserves, because I learned that the most efficient predators are those who disguise their hunting as acts of mercy, and the most dangerous enemies are those who know exactly where to place the knife to cause maximum damage while maintaining the appearance of reluctant necessity. The moment grief stopped paralyzing me and started fueling something far more dangerous came on a rain-soaked evening when I discovered Hiroshi rifling through Takeshi's private papers in our bedroom, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a professional thief as he searched for any genuine documents that might contradict the elaborate fiction his family had constructed around my husband's supposed financial irresponsibility. He froze when he realized I was watching from the doorway, his face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and finally settling on the cold calculation of a predator who had been caught in the act but possessed enough confidence in his position to abandon all pretense of sympathy or respect. His words carried the weight of unveiled threats as he explained that he was merely protecting the family's interests by ensuring that no inconvenient evidence could complicate the legal proceedings they had set in motion, his tone suggesting that my cooperation in this process was expected rather than requested. But here's what they didn't know. My husband had taught me more than just how to manage household accounts during our 7 years of marriage, sharing with me the strategic thinking that had made him a successful merchant before the war, and preparing me for the possibility that his death might leave me vulnerable to exactly the kind of systematic exploitation his family was now attempting to execute. Takeshi had shown me how to read people's weaknesses like maps of enemy territory, how to gather intelligence through seemingly innocent conversations, and how to patience of a military strategist who understands that the most devastating attacks require months of careful preparation before the first blow is struck. I began systematically investigating each conspirator's vulnerabilities, discovering that Kenji's apparent financial stability was built on a foundation of secret debts to merchant houses in distant provinces, debts that could destroy his reputation and social standing if revealed to the wrong people at the right moment. Midori's perfect facade of respectable wifehood concealed a long-term affair with the village carpenter, their meetings conducted with the regularity of a business arrangement in a storage building behind the temple where they believed their activities remained hidden from community observation. The corrupt officials who had been purchased to support their theft each carried their own burden of compromising secrets, gambling addictions, embezzled tax receipts, and family scandals that could end careers and destroy lives if strategically revealed to those who possessed the authority to act on such information. My grief transformed into something sharper and more surgical than mere anger, becoming a calculated fury that manifested in increasingly bold acts of psychological warfare designed to turn the conspirators against each other by exploiting the very greed that had united them in their assault against my inheritance. I began dropping subtle hints about Kenji's financial difficulties during conversations with his business partners, planting seeds of doubt about his reliability that would slowly erode the network of commercial relationships that supported his merchant activities. Anonymous letters found their way to Midori's husband, detailing the location and timing of her adultery, while carefully placed rumors about the corrupt officials' various crimes began circulating through channels that would eventually reach the ears of their superiors in the provincial bureaucracy. Have you ever felt the precise moment when grief stops being passive sorrow and transforms into an active force that hungers for justice with the patience of a predator who has learned to think strategically about revenge? What I discovered about my own capacity for calculated retribution would have terrified even the men who had underestimated me so completely, because they had mistaken my tears for weakness when they were actually preparation for a war they could never have imagined themselves capable of losing to a woman they had dismissed as just another helpless widow whose resistance could be crushed through superior masculine authority and social pressure. The revelation that my apparent vulnerability had been strategic camouflage came during the formal hearing where Takeshi's family expected to present their fabricated evidence and claim legal control over his estate, confident that their months of preparation had created an insurmountable case against my fitness to inherit what my husband had died protecting. They entered the magistrate's chamber with the swagger of hunters approaching wounded prey, their forged documents arranged in neat stacks, and their corrupted witnesses positioned like chess pieces, ready to deliver coordinated testimony that would destroy my reputation and transfer everything I owned into their grasping hands. The taste of their anticipated victory was sweet on their tongues as they watched me take my place at the defendant's table, a lone woman facing an army of masculine authority supported by purchased lies and fabricated evidence. But I had spent those same months methodically destroying each conspirator's livelihood, reputation, and family standing through a campaign of strategic information warfare that turned their own network of corruption against them with the surgical precision of a master strategist who had learned patience from the best teacher imaginable, the burning desire to honor my husband's memory by ensuring that his killers understood the true cost of their betrayal. The first surprise came when Kenji's primary business partner publicly terminated their commercial relationship due to concerns about debts and questionable financial practices, leaving him unable to provide the economic credibility that formed the foundation of his claim to superior judgment in managing family assets. The second shock arrived when Midori's husband appeared at the hearing to demand that his adulterous wife be excluded from any inheritance discussions, her moral authority to speak about family honor having evaporated in the wake of revelations about her extramarital activities that had become common knowledge throughout the village. The corrupted officials who had been purchased to facilitate this legal theft discovered that their own criminal activities had been exposed to their superiors through anonymous reports supported by meticulously documented evidence that demonstrated both their willingness to accept bribes and their participation in conspiracy to defraud a war widow of her rightful inheritance. The merchant witnesses who had agreed to provide false testimony about Takeshi's supposed gambling debts found themselves facing their own creditors, who had been informed through strategic channels about hidden assets and undisclosed income that suggested systematic tax evasion and commercial fraud that made their testimony unreliable in matters requiring truthful representation. The spirits of dishonored dead do not rest quietly, and I became the instrument through which my husband's ghost claimed payment for their betrayal of his final wishes, watching as each conspirator's carefully constructed life began collapsing under the weight of consequences they had never imagined possible when they dismissed me as just another helpless victim whose resistance could be crushed through superior masculine authority. Their network of corruption, which had seemed so formidable when directed against a grief-stricken widow, proved fragile as spider webs when subjected to systematic attack by someone who understood both their weaknesses and the patience required to exploit those vulnerabilities with maximum effectiveness. If you had the power to destroy everyone who had tried to steal from your family's memory, would you show mercy? Or would you make them pay the full price for their betrayal of everything sacred between the living and the dead? What I chose next would determine whether justice or vengeance ruled my heart, because the widow's justice I had crafted proved more thorough and ruthless than any legal system, leaving my enemies financially ruined, socially disgraced, and spiritually haunted by their participation in dishonoring a soldier who had died serving their country while they remained safely at home plotting to steal from his widow. The final confrontation took place not in the magistrate's chamber, but in the same shrine room where I had first discovered their forged documents, the sacred space now transformed into a courtroom where the living faced judgment from the spirits of those they had attempted to dishonor through systematic theft disguised as protective intervention. Kenji knelt before me with the posture of a defeated general surrendering to a superior strategist, his commercial empire in ruins and his reputation destroyed by the strategic revelation of financial crimes that had turned his business partners against him and left him facing bankruptcy that would strip away everything he had accumulated through decades of careful merchant activity. Midori's marriage had dissolved in spectacular scandal. Her social standing evaporated, and her access to family resources terminated by a husband who could not tolerate the public humiliation of her exposed adultery that had become the subject of village gossip and moral condemnation. Their carefully assembled network of corrupted officials and purchased witnesses had collapsed like a house built on foundations of sand. Each conspirator discovering that their participation in the plot to steal my inheritance had exposed them to legal prosecution and social ostracism that would follow them for the remainder of their lives. The magistrate who should have overseen their theft instead found himself investigating a complex web of fraud and conspiracy that reached into every level of local government, his own reputation requiring the dramatic prosecution of corruption that could cleanse his office of suspicion about its integrity and competence in protecting the rights of vulnerable citizens. My apparent grief-stricken helplessness had been strategic camouflage for a methodical campaign of psychological and financial warfare that demonstrated how completely they had underestimated the intelligence, patience, and ruthless determination of a woman whose love for her dead husband had transformed into something far more dangerous than mere sorrow. They had awakened not a victim, but an avenging spirit who understood their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. And I watched their destruction unfold with the satisfaction of a master craftsman observing the completion of a complex project that had required months of careful planning and precise execution to achieve its intended result. In feudal Japan, they said that the fury of a wronged woman could topple mountains, and they were right. But what they never understood was that such fury achieves its most devastating effects through patience rather than passion, through strategic thinking rather than emotional outbursts, and through the systematic exploitation of enemies' weaknesses rather than direct confrontation that gives opponents opportunities to rally their defenses against obvious attacks. Like a spider that had allowed flies to enter her web before revealing the trap, I had let them think they were hunters when they were always the prey. Their predatory confidence blinding them to the reality that their victim possessed both the intelligence to understand their strategy and the determination to turn that strategy against them with compound interest on every attempt to steal what belonged to her by right of marriage and love. Sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to become something the living will fear forever. And as I knelt in that shrine room, surrounded by the wreckage of their conspiracy and the restored tablets bearing my husband's true name and noble reputation, I understood that my transformation from grieving widow to avenging strategist had preserved not just my inheritance, but the memory of a man who had died believing that his sacrifice would protect those he loved from exactly the kind of predatory relatives who mistake grief for weakness and attempt to profit from the vulnerability of those who mourn with genuine hearts. Sometimes, the only way to honor the dead is to become something the living will fear forever. And as I knelt in that shrine room, surrounded by the wreckage of their conspiracy and the restored tablets bearing my husband's true name and noble reputation, I understood that my transformation from grieving widow to avenging strategist had preserved not just my inheritance, but the memory of a man who had died believing that his sacrifice would protect those he loved from exactly the kind of predatory relatives who mistake grief for weakness and attempt to profit from the vulnerability of those who mourn with genuine hearts.